Welcome to this Getting Started course for SharePoint 2010 developers. In this module we're going to delve straight into building web parts for SharePoint, as perhaps they are the most common type of development project that you will undertake. Now when you build a web part, you will build a reusable component effectively that can be used on many different pages and in fact on many different sites. And the great thing about a web part is that it can be very easily added to a web part page by a non-technical user, such as perhaps a project manager or business unit manager. As a developer, you will use Visual Studio 2010 to create your web parts, and you can use, for example, a visual web part and design your user interface with a graphical design surface. So you can simply drag and drop checkboxes, text boxes, labels, drop-down lists to your control. Of course, you can also add your own custom business logic in the form of code files to perform some sort of action that interacts with the user. And then you can deploy your web part from Visual Studio because of its tight integration with SharePoint. It has a packaging designer and process that will allow you to press Ctrl and F5 to package your web part and deploy it to SharePoint. So let's take a look at some examples. Well, first of all, we need to understand that there are two types of web parts. Visual web parts that allow you to drag and drop controls from the toolbox, and we have standard ASP.NET web parts where you will build up your user interface and your logic in a class file. And in this first example, we will take a look at the visual web part type. So Visual Studio provides different views of our web part, so you can choose the one that suits you best. What I'm showing you here is the split view, where we have the graphical design surface near the bottom of the screen and the source, or the markup if you like, near the top of the screen. So we can use the toolbox and drag and drop controls to either of these panes, and from there we can either use the properties window to set properties, or we can type property values directly into the markup. So in this example we have a very simple ASP.NET label called message, and if we look at the code behind, we can actually add our own code as well. So we will set the text property of that label, which was called message, to a suitable welcome message, and in this case we will say welcome to SharePoint 2010 development. Now we can deploy our web part very straightforwardly by pressing Ctrl and F5 from Visual Studio, which will package and deploy the web part, and we can add it to a web part page with a very few simple clicks. So this is what our web part looks like. We have our message that says welcome to SharePoint development. So let's take a look at a standard web part example now. A standard web part does not have a design surface as such, so we'll build up our visual user interface in code. The important thing to note is that a standard web part inherits from the standard ASP.NET web part. So what we will do is we will typically override the create child controls method. And in our code here, we start interacting with the SharePoint object model. So I'm retrieving the user's login name from the SharePoint object model via spcontext.current.web.currentuser.login name, and I can store that in my string variable. Then I can start adding ASP.NET controls, and in this case I'm building a literal control called myMessage, and in its constructor I'll set it equal to the value that we've retrieved from SharePoint plus my welcome string. So we will say welcome, whatever the user's name is, to SharePoint development. And very importantly, we must add this control to the control tree, and we do that via this.controls.add. That's very important for ASP.NET controls, especially if they have server-side events. And again, I can press Ctrl plus F5 and with a few clicks add my web part to a web part page in SharePoint. So this is the result. We've retrieved the currently logged on user's name, which is Bobby Moore, from the SharePoint object model, and used that in our welcome message. So this has been a very brief introduction to web parts, but hopefully you can see how easy it is to get started at least, and we'll delve much further into the object model and so forth in later videos.